You want me to print 700,000 pages because you don't like PDFs? No problem, but it's going to cost you dearly. My first job after university was at an aerospace company, quite well known for its passenger airplanes. I quickly got into the work and optimized many outdated processes. One of these processes, which saved the company a ton of money, was switching from paper documentation to PDF files. The company consumed a massive amount of A4 and A3 paper every day, and service engineers for laser printers and copiers came to us once a week. My work saved the company around $5,000 in the first month alone, and that number kept growing as more and more stages of engineering review and document handling moved to PDFs. A couple of years after I started, my boss's direct supervisor hired a guy from Kansas who spoke painfully slowly. He jumped from place to place and came to us because his friend had become a manager here. That friend was one of the few managers who refused to adopt my new secure PDF licensing system. By that time, I had already received several promotions and was leading a team of 10 people, overseeing their work and sending results to my boss, who was now focusing less on my previous tasks and more on process automation, including training staff to press F7 and spend 5 minutes checking spelling. Then he wrote a script that did the same for every document, so we didn't have to pay FAA inspectors for rejecting documents over trivial punctuation and spelling mistakes. Formally, the Kansas guy was hired as an editor, which meant I had to work with him on the document submission process and get his input on how to best integrate manual review for special business areas into our system. Everything went extremely badly. At our first meeting, it took him more than a minute to finish a sentence of less than 10 words, not counting repetitions and drawn-out pauses. At the second meeting, he said to me, "Dude, you need to slow down or you'll put yourself out of work." Decades later, when I first played Red Dead Redemption 2 and heard Arthur Morgan speak, I almost turned off the game. If Arthur had spoken 20 words in 50 seconds, it would have sounded exactly like this Kansas guy. To put it mildly, it was irritating. Eventually, our conflicts reached a peak when he was given enough authority to demand printed copies of documents before reviewing them. At one point, he slowed the process so much that he created a bottleneck in 4 projects, supposedly to properly train people on editing. He also worked overtime and took work home, which, as far as I could tell, meant he was just leaving papers on his desk and watching football. Because he was paid hourly, any task he had to review ended up taking twice the planned labor hours. And since access to my PDF review system required login, tracking connection time, access, and document changes, he hated it. I was salaried and perfectly happy with that, but I constantly faced the fact that this clown was spending hours and days reviewing what could have been done in minutes if he just learned 3 buttons, and he refused. Eventually, I went to the engineering director and explained what was happening. This led to a conversation with the Kansas guy's friend, who insisted that the PDF review system was unsafe, which was a lie, inefficient, also a lie, and that everything should be done the way the Kansas guy was used to. Months passed, and the project stalled mainly because of the Kansas guy's review process. Finally, the last week before the project deadline arrived, and my team had completed everything on our side. On Monday, the director called me in and said that since this engineering manager was tied to a new project, the final decision on documentation and installation instructions remained with him, and my team should provide full support. Then he invited me to play golf with him over the weekend. I don't play golf, never have. I can play mini golf if there are 4 clowns and a beer involved. The last time I played real golf, I somehow hit the caddy twice with a club. Nobody has ever figured out how I did it. So inviting me to play golf was not the best idea. I Googled for you. A caddy is the golfer's assistant, carries the bag with clubs and balls, helps choose the right club, evaluates distance to the hole, and gives advice during the game. Then I received an official memo, a real paper one, in the email era from the Kansas guy, inviting me to a meeting about document submission. By lunchtime, I had already spent 4 hours in meetings with him and his manager, whom almost everyone in the company called a stickler. They smugly outlined their requirements for the document submission process. Given carte blanche to manage the project until the end, these two sat and dictated exactly how everything should be done. All documents had to be ready by Friday afternoon for personal review by the Kansas guy and his paid interns, the only one who hadn't quit after transferring to their team. And this was over 700,000 pages of reports, assessments, drawings, installation instructions, and more. I was specifically told that the project was under the personal supervision of the company president, and they insisted that all of this be printed fully on paper. Those smug _ left the meeting practically grinning from ear to ear with delight. At that point, the company had so few printers left that the only machine capable of handling this volume was a huge copier or printer in the document archive. Everything else, ordinary office lasers, could take a maximum of 3 reams. In short, printing this many pages would require the full capacity of the company, if not more. Hiring a contractor was impossible in such tight deadlines. And since overseeing the production of documentation fell into my responsibility, it all technically fell on me. They also said that if I finished by Friday, the company would receive a client bonus, which was extremely important as we wanted to impress them to secure more orders in the future. Not surprisingly, the company's profit-sharing system meant bonuses went to those representing the project, meaning them and everyone else who actually worked hard would get a $5 Starbucks gift card. Yes, seriously. On Tuesday, I pulled all 10 team members off their current tasks and reassigned them to printing. We occupied every printer in the building, including the president's personal Xerox used by his secretary. The guys worked 4 hours of overtime daily with pizza and beer among mountains of paper. We turned our large meeting rooms into makeshift printing facilities, and I stationed myself in the archive by the big beast to run the bulk of the printing. By the end of the week, colleagues were flooded with complaints. People whined about taking over meeting rooms, running out of staples and paper, and print queues jammed to the max. At one point, even the FAA project representative stormed in demanding to know when he could finally print his files, the very ones needed to submit this pile of stuff. We finished Thursday night with a 3 a.m. buffer before the Friday morning deadline. We delivered everything to the Kansas guy's workspace. All 700,000 pages in boxes amounted to roughly 2 cubic meters, carefully stacked in his cubicle, following ACE 9000 standards and safety regulations to avoid blocking the emergency exit. And, of course, an electronic copy was sent to the FAA inspector, who had to check the entire document package before submission, especially those that differed from standard templates or were added at the client's request or formatted in a new way. New or modified pages had to be seen in print, but only those. So yes, we almost completely buried the Kansas guy's desk in paper, but that wasn't the really nasty part of the story. When I first joined the company, one of the new hires who was with me during onboarding had a habit of inserting a tiny vector image, the mascot of his university, into every file. It was so small that even on a full-size engineering drawing, it was barely visible. It was his personal joke. A few engineers from a rival university picked up the idea and began inserting their own mascots as vector drawings into their designs. Later, someone made a vector model from a popular 1980s cartoon, which at a certain scale no longer looked like a transforming robot, but a small standard metric bolt, and added it to the standard parts library with a note, "Do not use this template." None of these things, of course, were allowed in official engineering specifications, not even as drawings. Even if a plotter at maximum magnification couldn't see it, whether it was a university mascot, a maple leaf, or a silly 1980s robot, the only reason the company tolerated it was that no one was foolish enough to scale every CAD component to check how each part should look. When I realized what could happen if someone noticed, or if these models ended up in the official submission package, I made the engineers who were doing this for fun review their old drawings and remove all these mascots. I also asked them to notify everyone else who might be doing the same. Since the engineering database allowed searching by part number, I marked these drawings for editing so responsible people would remove the extras. Unfortunately, nobody knew that one stickler had added his own vector image to the templates he forced his team to use. A maple leaf with a naked woman spreading her legs while holding a hockey stick right in front of her crotch. This filth never entered the main template database because the engineering team and the template review group I had created for this purpose never received a copy of the template set from his group, as he refused to use standard templates because they didn't meet his standards. And nobody knew that he had left this garbage on every template he made his team use, because he was one of the obstinate people refusing to work through the drawing registration system in the main database until he personally approved them from his team. He did upload them to the approved drawings database, but only after they were already sent to both the client and the FAA, so copies of the latest files were there, but he didn't participate in the rest of the process. His excuse was simple: that's how my team works better. This meant that any assigned part number he chose often conflicted with existing numbers in the database. This constantly caused meetings to resolve the issue, explaining that maybe the database should be checked first to avoid duplicating numbers for completely different parts in different drawings. On top of that, this __ put his name on almost every drawing, regardless of who actually made it. Therefore, anyone who wanted information about the project had to go to him, not the person who created the model. He was the highest reason for staff turnover in the company for many reasons. But the main problem was that he constantly claimed credit for engineering drawings he hadn't even touched. In a company where the number of drawings you completed directly affected your performance rating, this was a big deal. Another reason was his obsessive focus on useless work that provided no value to the client. And of course, he acted like __ toward anyone who dared to say no, especially those refusing to work weekends when his team couldn't meet project deadlines. And this giant project was no exception. For this document submission project, he demanded printing and attaching a full catalog of every modeled part and component to each engineering drawing, so the client, who hadn't asked for it, could determine which part they needed. His logic was that since we supplied 60% of all these parts, this ensured the client would know they could only buy from us. The only thing he agreed to automate in this process was a script that expanded each component of the engineering drawing to a full page and included it in the official engineering parts list. You already guessed what this led to. I took Friday off, but got a call Monday morning from the vice president's personal assistant. She asked me to come to the office urgently for an important meeting. On Friday afternoon, I entered the conference room next to my director's office. He had the hardest expression I'd ever seen as he opened the door and let me into one of the loudest proceedings I've ever attended. At the table sat an FAA representative, the company president, our department vice president, the Kansas guy, and the stickler. The usually friendly, portly FAA representative was yelling at the Kansas guy and the stickler, explaining how serious this was and how they would embarrass the company if this stuff was submitted. He said that if he had allowed these materials, it would trigger a complete review of every document he had ever approved while working with our company. When the yelling subsided a little, my director asked me if I knew of any non-standard drawings or images in our engineering catalog database. I replied, "Well, yes, these are template examples of parts which are automatically removed from the template when someone copies it to their local disk. They're just examples, marked as such. Nobody keeps them. They're removed from the drawing as soon as the person save a local copy of the template." At that point, the vice president, a woman around 40 hired to clean out the company's old male corporate culture, said, "You seriously keep this in your template database as an example?" She held up a stack of paper as thick as a whole ream, on which were printed huge 18-plus vector images in the style of Canadian hockey, with disgusting sexual wordplay in the part numbers, neatly formatted as 3D engineering isometric diagrams. My jaw dropped, and I think I made a weird sound that could have been suppressed laughter. The Kansas guy and the stickler were told, "You're responsible for supporting the entire engineering parts database, so explain to everyone present why this is in the database. Can you say you've never seen this image before?" I glanced at the Kansas guy and the stickler. Both looked at me like chickens staring at a man with a cleaver heading for the grindstone, because I had seen a full-size printed copy of this drawing colored in with markers on the Kansas guy's desk. Then I said, "Hey, you probably should remove this. You can't keep that in the office," to which I received a long explanation of where I should go. He knew perfectly well I knew where I'd seen this drawing, and although I didn't know exactly where he got it, it wasn't hard to guess. They both knew I had no intention of taking responsibility for their mess. The bus was already rolling downhill, and even though I didn't shove them under it as they tried to do to me, I certainly wasn't going to save them. I silently opened my mouth a couple of times and then said, "Yes, I can honestly say this image is not in the engineering database. Never has been. I can show what's there and the history of part numbers. I know for sure there's no such number." I opened the template database on the director's computer. We checked the entire template database, reviewing all possible variations of this number until the vice president was satisfied. Then she asked, "And you and your team didn't see this while printing everything this week?" I replied, "I can't speak for everyone, but if someone had, we would have acted immediately. We would have notified the drawing reviewer, the Kansas guy, and the engineer whose name is on the drawing. To remove it immediately, we can run a search through the engineering database to find which drawings have this number, including hidden elements." The stickler said, "Oh no, that would take too much time. Everything must be submitted by the end of the day." And the Kansas guy, for the first time in his life, repeated the exact same phrase without pauses. The president, sitting grimly in the corner, said, "This project is frozen until we determine how compromised these engineering drawings are. Every drawing with this part must be reviewed by at least 3 people, including the lead engineer who approved it, and at least 1 senior manager from the engineering department not involved in this project. We will not tolerate such underscoring." The Kansas guy and the stickler turned pale as paper and stared at me with pleading eyes. The axe was sharp. The question was only whether we'd serve fried chicken or duck today. The president looked at me and said, "Run the search. I don't care how long it takes. I want a printed copy of every drawing with this part on the vice president's desk and the same copy for everyone in this room, showing who created, reviewed, and approved the drawing." I was one of the few people in the company with admin access to the engineering parts database because I had helped build it. I had set up an automatic rule forcing all users to change their password every month to a new one, at least 16 characters with numbers and special symbols. I knew for sure that no one except me had access now. My director knew the same. He once had access but kept forgetting the code and asked to remove it from the search. I replied, "Of course, it will take at least 6 hours. Do you want me to stay and finish it today?" The director exchanged glances with the vice president and president and then said, "No, you and your team have already worked over 80 hours this week for this deadline. Take the weekend and deliver results by Monday noon." The Kansas guy and the stickler twitched like they wanted to jump, but didn't dare. I took a secure laptop from IT that I normally use for the database, went to the server room, connected it, logged in under my account, locked the screen with an authentication key, removed it from the USB port, put it in my pocket, and went home. About 10 minutes after I left, my work phone started ringing. Then notifications started pouring in. Since my number was only with the director, and he would call on his mobile first, I immediately realized it was the Kansas guy and the stickler. So I ignored all calls and notifications. They could go screw themselves. The next day, I went to play golf with the director in a charity tournament he organized. The president and his wife were there too. All 3 agreed I played golf terribly, but at least it was funny. I stayed for dinner and the charity auction, got drunk enough to call a taxi, and asked the club's valet to take my car home. Sunday I spent at home recovering. On Monday morning, I went to the IT server room and was surprised to find the laptop I had left connected was gone. After talking to IT, I found out that on Saturday morning the Kansas guy claimed he urgently needed the laptop to deliver a critical report to the president by the end of the day. By noon, he pressured a support guy earning $15 an hour to let him into the server room to check the laptop. An hour later, he said he was done and left. As I walked past the stickler's workspace after learning about the laptop incident, I saw him sitting with the Kansas guy, discussing something. The Kansas guy looked at me with a smug grin and lost interest. The stickler still looked worried but calmer. After a short 5-minute conversation, the director said you didn't need to make printed copies or come in on Saturday. A PDF would have sufficed. "Yeah, but you know how Kansas guys and the stickler love their paper," I replied, handing each of them a thick stack of printed database outputs, looking them in the eye. Anyway, I got up early Saturday for the golf tournament, so I returned the president's laser printer and made the copies. When I handed over the lists, I said, I already gave copies to everyone else Saturday morning. The list included every engineering drawing completed by the team. Each page had the responsible name as the creator or approving engineer. The Kansas guy was listed as the reviewer. Over 40,000 engineering drawings contained that 18-plus image, and the project itself had almost 150,000 pages of documentation referencing these drawings and using their vector elements. By noon, the Kansas guy's workspace was completely empty. The stickler was escorted out under security, and the Kansas guy, realizing the situation, resigned before HR could finish processing his termination. I left the company a few years later. I'd like to say those two never worked in aviation again, but sadly, within months, they were employed by a major airplane manufacturer. That's why I left aviation. If you're wondering why this tiny thing, barely visible on an engineering drawing, caused such a serious problem, here's the explanation. Even if it's not visible, models submitted for approval sometimes include full vector drawings as part of the package, containing all content on the drawing. Any non-compliant drawing violating FAA rules could be rejected entirely in bulk. The FAA can suspend an entire fleet if it decides you misplace commas in a sentence describing how to install a toilet seat. Add to that the requirement that the FAA inspector must manually check every submitted drawing with changes for any active aircraft. They must see what was changed, get an explanation for why it was done, approve or reject the change, forward it for final approval, and submit a request to integrate it into the documentation for every manual and document set where the vector element is used. That's a huge volume. The cost of this process easily reaches thousands of dollars for a single drawing change years later, almost always paid by the company that made the error. So yes, reviewing all the stickler's old drawings was not a minor issue. It wasn't a small mistake. It was a multi-million-dollar disaster in 2002 dollars. Some of this even ended up in official FAA documentation for airplanes that still fly, both passenger and cargo aircraft. And that's the story. Thank you for listening to it all the way through. Be sure to check out our previous videos, which you can find right here. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you won't miss new content. If you enjoyed this story, leave a like and comment your thoughts. What would you have done in this situation? We love hearing your opinions. Thanks again, and good luck.